So as she said, my name is Levi. And of course, like if you guys have questions, I would definitely prefer you guys just ask or stop me as I'm talking. I would prefer this to be more interactive rather than just me talking at you. And so, as she said, I work at Children's Mercy. I am a behavioral health clinician. My husband and I have fostered roughly 47 kids over the past 10 years. We've had Wyandotte County as well as Johnson County. And so, yeah, have tons of experience with all kinds of situations and things. So to kick off, I would like to start with Kansas-specific data. And so as of 2023, there were roughly 5,968 kids in foster care in the state of Kansas. One of the main frequent reasons for abuse and neglect, or one of the main reasons why a child is in place is for abuse and neglect. Physical abuse being the leading cause. There are 1,298 African American children, which makes up 21%, and then 4,649, which is totaling 75% of the youth in Kansas. So those are Kansas-specific numbers and data. And so the average length of time of placement for a child who is in care is roughly 23.3 months. So average length of time while they're in custody of DCF is roughly around right around a year, or 2 years, sorry. And so there were 564 adoptions finalized, with 52% of those being with relative placements. And then Kansas had 2,767 homes in 2019. They have 2,805 in 2021, and then 2,343 in 2023. So as you can see, kind of the numbers fluctuate, go up and down within the state over the past couple of years. So one thing I usually like to share is it really depends where you are in the state, which kind of agency you're most familiar with. And so I like this map because it does a really good job of breaking it down kind of by areas or categories. So depending on where you are, you may see St. Francis, you may see KVC, TFI, Cornerstones of Care. And so those are the contractors that are through the state from DCF to then implement and support foster care kiddos. And so depending on where you kind of fall in the state may depend on who you have. I have also had a lot of experience with, so I am currently licensed with Cornerstones. And then our last placement was with a KVC kiddo. And so you can take kiddos from different parts of the state or different organizations. And so sometimes that does get a little tricky because case managers can come from a different agency than what your licensing worker comes from. And so sometimes there's different rules, regulations, depending on the agency. And so sometimes that does get a little tricky to navigate, but helpful to know. Another thing that I usually like to mention is ICWA, and so that's the Indian Child Welfare Act. Being Native myself, my husband and I are allowed and capable of taking Native children if one was to come into custody. And so basically what that means is that there's a federal law in place to protect Native children. And so there is a preference for them to be placed with a Native family to kind of help with keeping their culture and different things kind of intact. And so that was kind of reasons why that was established was when you go back to when Native children were taken out of the home and then placed into schools and school systems and things like that. That's kind of why this law came into place. And so in Kansas, in 2023, there were 126 Native children that only totaled up 2.1% of all the kids that were in care. And so if a Native child is placed into care, the law states that the family must receive access to and make efforts for culturally appropriate and available resources. And then consultation with extended family members known to the Secretary, Tribal Designated Kansas Indian Welfare Act representative, if an extended family member cannot be located, to identify family or tribal supports. So essentially what that means is that the tribal welfare office kind of steps in and tries to help locate either family members based on tribal roles or different things like that to try and locate family that the child can be placed with. And so super helpful to know. We have had some instances where some kids were in our custody and then we found out later that they were native. Sometimes they can get moved from your home. If it comes out that they end up being native or different things, it can also mess up adoptions, all things like that. If you're not for sure if your child is ICWA, you can always ask the worker and they should be able to let you know. And so it's helpful to understand, I think, language around when you're talking about specific workers that you may interact with or come into contact with. And so the provider is the service provider who DCF contracts with. So that is KVC, TFI, Cornerstones of Care. Those are the providers for the foster care agencies. The case manager is usually a professional, sometimes social worker, who's responsible for working with the family to write and implement a case plan. So this person is usually involved in the child's life pretty heavily. They're the ones that come to the house every month, do check-ins with the child, pick up the child for different things, help with appointments. They're essentially the guardian of the child while they're in state custody. And so the case manager follows the child typically from house to house or location to location. And so just helpful to know. Family support worker, that is somebody who is in support of the family. So usually it comes from whoever you're licensed with. And so that person is there to advocate for you, whereas the case manager is there to advocate more so for the child. So the case manager's goal is to make sure that all things related to the child is good. And then the family support worker is to make sure that everything with the family is good. And then they usually work in tandem with each other to help support the family to make sure you have all of the available resources and things that you might need. Sometimes if you end up taking a family placement or someone that's related, or there's been a kiddo or two that we've taken whom I've worked with in a professional capacity, sometimes they're placed with us as a kinship placement. And so what that is essentially saying is that the child is aware of who I am. And so we're seen as kind of family. If I have an established relationship with them. So you can take a kinship placement and then you would get a kinship worker. And so that would be somebody who also just helps with the placement of the child along in tandem with the case manager. And then the parent advocate provides support, education, trainings. It's usually one individual, two individuals within the agencies to help support families that are licensed and things like that. It's usually who does your trainings for when you initially start and get licensed. That's usually a parent advocate that helps. And then CASA worker, that's somebody who's assigned from the court that supports the child. They typically do, we've had some that's done weekly visits. We've had some that has done monthly visits. I believe a law changed a couple of years ago where essentially everyone is assigned a CASA worker. I'm not sure if that's Johnson County specific or if that's state specific. But essentially every child should have a CASA worker who is an advocate that works with the court system to kind of update the court on the case and like what's happening and is the child in a good placement, all of those things. And then of course the guardian ad litem or GAL, you may have heard them be talked about in that manner. And so that's an attorney appointed by the court to represent the best interests of the child. They help advocate for the child. We've had some who have been super involved, and then we've had some that have been kind of MIA or we hardly hear from. So it really kind of runs the gamut of all of these individuals. But your family support worker and your case manager should at least at minimum be doing monthly visits. And then typically, if you're having issues like accessing resources, needing help with transportation, getting appointments set up, any of those things, the case manager would help with that. But your family support worker can also help if you're needing like additional support within the home, whether that be therapy or any other kind of resources like that. They can also help with those. Any questions so far? Perfect. Okay, so some things that my husband and I sat down and kind of talked about prior to ever taking our first placement. I think these are things that each family kind of dependent on should consider. And so does the ethnicity or race make an impact on your decision to take a child? So being a gay family, are we going to make an impact, especially like when you think about race, is that going to make an impact on that child negatively, positively? All things kind of got to consider. Another one is, does a child identify as being LGBTQIA plus make an impact? So if you were to take a trans child, is that going to impact you or how you view things? Or I often know that churches are the ones that usually do the recruiting for foster homes. And so do your beliefs not support that population, those kinds of things? If you were to take a trans or a gay child, is that going to impact anything within your life? Are they going to be supported? Those kinds of things. Does your religion and cultural beliefs matter versus you may end up with a child who has very different beliefs? Are you going to be able to support them? Those kinds of things. How many children are you willing to take placement for? That is always a fun one. My husband and I have been asked to take several kids at once. When we lived in a 900,000 square foot home, they were trying to place like 5 or 6 kids with us, try to talk us into 2 bunk beds into a little bitty room, just to try and get kids placed because we were only taking teenagers at the time. And so it does get quite interesting at times. But really think about how many children are you willing to take? If the child has siblings, are you open to taking them? Sometimes, not always, are they super involved with one another? And sometimes things happen and a sibling may not come into custody until later. And so would you be willing to take them if that was to be the case? And so another important thing to think about is age ranges. When you're thinking about age range before and after school care, that was why my husband and I never took younger kids, was because I always felt like we were going to struggle with trying to find childcare before or after school. And so the youngest we have ever taken is 6. And so typically I would say most of the time we take anything from 13, 14 and up. Just because of that, sometimes it's a little bit easier to finagle our schedules around high school kids than a baby, for instance. And so definitely think about those age ranges. And then there are different licensing requirements for under the age of 6 versus 6 and over. And so those are things to take into consideration also, including like light cover or outlet covers and all kinds of things like that, that you may have to take into consideration if you take a younger one. And then, are you wanting to only foster or are you considering adoption? I think this is an important one to really consider and think about, because if you're only in it to foster, and sometimes it's just to give a child a placement versus long time signing papers, changing names, doing all that thing, and then becoming completely responsible for a child is very different than just fostering. I think that both are super important. My husband and I have only adopted 1 child. And so we could have adopted more, but just wasn't the right fits or different things kind of impacted those decisions. And so typically we usually go in with the mindset that we're only going to foster. My goal is to just get you stable, get you supports, give you kind of that stability for a little while. Because oftentimes I don't know if it's going to be a few nights, a few months, years, like never kind of really know. And so that's how we kind of usually approach it. And then, of course, I already mentioned before and after school care. And then I think an important thing that people forget about is travel restrictions. And so if you are leaving the state of Kansas for anything over 24 hours, you have to get approval for that. From the case manager. You usually have to let them know like where you're staying, the hotel name, or family member house that you're staying at, addresses, all of those things, how long you're going to be gone. I usually recommend, especially if you're flying, to get a letter just in case that if you have to take that child into the hospital for any reason, then you have a letter of support saying that you can have the child to begin with. and then you're not stressed out when you're there and trying to fumble through things. And then I always like to preface the technology use in home. So what is your home's rules and regulations going to be around technology use? Oftentimes, we do not let children have outside phones in our home just because those are things that we cannot monitor and regulate. We've had all kinds of things happen with technology use. And so it's just kind of one of those hard set rules that even if your family pays for the phone has to stay with your case manager. If you want to use it during that time, then that's fine. But we typically provide a phone then that we can monitor and track and make sure that it has limits and boundaries and settings and all those things that we can monitor while you're in our home and in our care. And then I think another important thing is parenting styles. So how do you guys parent? How are you guys going to approach parenting? How are you going to think about different things that you could come across throughout the time? Again, my husband and I, we parent very differently. He's more nurturing, whereas I'm kind of just direct. I don't beat around the bush or sugarcoat things. And so it can be interesting, but typically we kind of balance each other out in those instances. And so kind of thinking through some of those things. Another one I think is super important is boundaries with family members and the reintegration efforts. And so there have been some families that we have decided to, we have you only communicate with the case manager, and then that's how you communicate with us. We don't like to give our personal phone number or address out for any reason. And we typically share that with our placements also, that if your parents ask where you live, you can give a general vicinity, but I don't want my exact address given out for a variety of reasons. We've had parents show up, all kinds of situations come from that. And so it's just a lot easier to kind of get those things in place. And so it's just a lot easier usually to have the case manager communicate with the family. If there's been time that's passed and we can kind of see that things aren't going to go too crazy, then we can kind of step in and kind of help with the communication piece with the family directly. And so there have been times where we've supervised visits and different things like that to just kind of help out and make sure that the child is having access to their family members and things like that. After enough time has passed and things like that. And then another thing to consider is you can always ask if the parent rights have been terminated. And so this would be if you're thinking about you're wanting to adopt. Sometimes it's easier to take a child who the parental rights have already been terminated, because then that means that they're essentially up for adoption. And so if it's a good fit and it works out, then great, you guys could kind of just skip some of the steps and move right into adoption. Whereas if you're fostering and the parental rights have not been terminated, then you kind of have to wait and write it out and wait to see if the parental rights are going to be terminated. There's usually several court dates that are involved in that. And so just kind of depending on what your family wants to choose and kind of go that route. So this isn't usually super talked about. I feel like these are things that I've had to learn over the years. And so there are what we call levels of care within the foster care system. So when you think about basic one, that's going to be your child that comes in with not a lot of behavioral problems, maybe may have some verbal aggression here and there. Typically does not have a mental health diagnosis, doesn't have a lot of school concerns. I would say is usually you're pretty minimal, doesn't need a lot of support, can kind of complete their activities of daily living without much support, easy to redirect, just kind of chill, laid back, go with the flow type kids. Then your basic twos are going to have some physical verbal aggression here and there. Sometimes they usually will have a mental health diagnosis or some mental health needs. They may have like an undiagnosed or unspecified anxiety disorder or unspecified depression disorder or different things like that. Also usually not super level of care. Based on these level of care is also dependent upon how much daily rate you get per child. And so the higher the rate, the more intense they are. And so when you ask those questions, when they call to ask you if you want to take placement, you can always ask what level of care are they, and then how much the daily rate is. And that will usually give you a good idea of how intense the kid is, or how many needs the child's going to have prior to you accepting. And so basic 3 is moderate to high range on assessment. More school concerns, usually going to have an IEP, maybe a 504. More verbal, physical aggression. So this is one that has usually displayed both verbal and physical aggression. Then intense, there's intensive 1 and intensive 2. So the assessment tool that they use is usually their pretty moderate to severe physical or verbal aggression, and then demonstrated some sexual behaviors, more than 1 mental health diagnosis, and could potentially have legal issues. And then intensive 2 is kind of the highest range, and then that's going to be usually learning struggles, sexualized behavior, multiple mental health diagnoses, usually several medications. The ones that also fall into this category are the medically fragile kiddos. And so those are ones that if they have trachs, vents, any needs like that, or any like syndromes, typically will fall into this one, especially if you're thinking like ABA therapy and some of those more intensive therapies that you may need. Any questions about that so far? Perfect. Okay, so these are typically the list of questions that I go through when the foster care agency calls and asks me if I want to take placement. And so I always ask the age of the child. I always ask the reason for their coming into care, or why are they changing placement. So it's helpful for me to know, is this a kiddo who has never been in a placement before, coming straight into foster care? Oftentimes, if that's the case, they may not know why necessarily the child is coming into care, but they can usually figure it out and give you an idea. So that just kind of helps, whether you know it's like physical abuse, sexual abuse, any of those things, so that you can kind of prepare and decide yes or no. And then if it was a change in placement, is this a kiddo that got disrupted on that's now looking for placement? If so, how many placements have they been in? Will usually give you a good idea of where they fall on that level of care. And then we'll also give you a good idea of if they've had, 40 placements in a year, on average, they're moving every couple of weeks and not able to get stable. And so that's either really significant med changes or things like that that could be involved in that. And then involvement with law enforcement or court involvement. And so I always like to know, because we primarily have taken teens over the years, has there been any law enforcement contact? Has there been any police involvement within the last like 60 to 90 days? Do they have any open court cases? Do they have any charges against them? Because obviously I have animals in the home, and then I also have my adopted son. And so I always want to know, do they have charges for being physically aggressive and hurting or harming somebody? I have to take all of those things into consideration before taking placement. Medications, I feel like this is really indicative of if they're on a slew of medications. That's going to also give you a good indication of what you're kind of looking at diagnosis wise. Sometimes they may not always have a real great diagnosis, but if they're on a slew of medications, that's going to give you a good idea of the needs or level of care, again, where they're going to kind of fall in that. Another thing I always ask is a history of mental health inpatient treatment. And so what that means is, have they had any history of acute psychiatric hospital stays? And that could include Marillac, Crittenton, Prairie Ridge, any of those that are in the metro or around the state of Kansas. And so that will give you a good idea of how many have they had, and then what are they usually for. And so are they for suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation? When was the last one? How long were they there? And then was it an acute stay, or was it a PRTF or a psychiatric residential treatment facility, which is going to be your 60 to 90 day, so usually longer, anywhere up to 6 months of treatment. Will give you a good idea of kind of the mental health needs or behavioral needs from that aspect. Other thing I always like to consider is, does the child have siblings? So are there any biological siblings? So with our adopted son, he is, I think, 7 years younger than the other previous 8 children that were placed into custody, which is why he was removed and placed into custody right after he was born. And so pretty large age gap. He has never met any of his siblings. Of course, we have their names and all of that information for when he is that age where we can kind of talk through some of that. But he obviously doesn't know them, has no connection to them, wouldn't know them if we ran into them on the street. And so, but if there are a set of siblings, sometimes it is easier to take siblings just because they can all kind of adjust together versus being a sole child. And then again, how many placements has the child been in will give you a good indication. Or have they been in group homes bouncing around? Have they been in single night placements bouncing around? Have they been in a steady placement, but then got disrupted on due to behavioral concerns, different things like that. Because my husband and I both have a dog each. Again, we always ask, have they hurt animals, any history of hurting animals, physical aggression with animals, anything like that. And then obviously super important because we do, if you have biological children or adopted children already in the home who obviously like can't get disrupted on, do they get along with other children? Is there going to be any issues with older, younger? We have never done room shares other than for kind of overnights, but typically we try not to do any room shares with children when we take placements, especially until we kind of have that established rapport built with the child and kind of know them a little bit more. Then we can talk about bunking up and things like that. Any questions about any of these things that I like to ask? Perfect. Okay, so additional considerations are there any complex medical needs? So are there any known syndromes? Are there any diagnoses like autism, trisomy 13? Do they have any complex medical needs that would require several medical appointments? Are they in specialized care versus just kind of outpatient care? Have they had any inpatient stays for medical reasons, eating disorders, any of those things to kind of take into consideration? And then do they have a 504 or an IEP in place? If there's questions about learning concerns, sometimes if they bounced around a lot, it's super hard to get an IEP in place just because the length of time it takes to get one in place. If they bounce so many times, they fall through the cracks. And so those things haven't been done. And so I like to know those ahead of time because that tells me how much effort or work we're going to have to put in on the side. And sometimes knowing it in advance, like this child's going to need a really in-depth IEP, I already know my school is easy to work with or not easy to work with, right? Take all those things into consideration. And so current or past mental health services. So have they been in therapy? Is there any PTSD that needs to be addressed? Are there any sexualized behaviors that have been addressed, not addressed? Have they had case management support through like the community mental health centers, different services like that? Obviously, the case plan goals are always super helpful to know. So is it reintegration? Is the goal of the child to go back into the home of the parent? Is it that the parental rights have been terminated and so now adoption is the case plan goal? Those are always things to kind of know, I guess, in advance, depending on what kind of child you're wanting to take placement of. Religion of the child, obviously, if you're Catholic and then trying to take a Muslim child, is that going to be a big issue? And then any cultural considerations. So if you're having an African-American child in a white home, is that going to make a difference? Or I'm actually Native and Hispanic myself. And so we typically have taken quite a few Hispanic children. And so it's always interesting to take them to neighborhoods that they are familiar with or, traditional Hispanic food or things like that. Are you going to be able to access some of those things while they're in your care and custody? If you live in rural Kansas, the likelihood of you going to an actual authentic Mexican place is probably slim. And so just things to consider, think about, think through. And then another big one is, are they toilet trained? I obviously, with my work and my job, have a lot of experience with toilet training, but I much prefer the child to already be toilet trained, just because that's one more additional layer of things to take into consideration if they're, 8 with autism and then also are not toilet trained. Something to consider, just that extra time and money and everything else spent working on those skills. And then any disruptive events. So has the child had any events where there has been somebody that they've put hands on, police have been called, anything like that? So anything like that would be considered a disruptive event. Or if they've been like out of home placements several times, if they got disrupted on, you can usually find out if the child was disrupted on after an amount of time due to like a family moving or relocating or them closing their license, or was it that their behavior then caused them to get disrupted on? Big difference. Length of time in custody, I usually like to ask, just because if you've had a kiddo who has been in 5 years and has bounced around multiple placements every year, the likelihood of you stabilizing isn't non-existent, but also takes twice as much work. And so things to consider. And then how often are parent visitations? And so if you live in Western Kansas and your child's family lives in KCK, that child's going to be spending, if they have weekly visits, they're going to be spending on the weekend, 3-4 hours one way in the car, an hour visitation, then 3 or 4 hours back. And so if you have other kids in sports and other things like that, that can often be super impeding, or vice versa. If you have a child from Western Kansas and live in Johnson County, that's a big time shift differential between the two, and shuttling and making sure visits happen. And then any visits with extended family. So are grandma and grandpa involved? Are aunt and uncle involved? Are there older siblings that are involved? Any of those things, what does that kind of look like? Because all of that's going to impact your child, and then scheduling wise and all those things. Behavioral health needs. So history of diagnoses, are there any self-harm, or has there been any reported or documented self-harm attempts, or do they cut? Any of those things are super important when you think about means restriction, accessing knives, all those things. Any suicide attempts, is there therapy in place, or was there therapy in place? Are we able to maintain and keep that same therapist if it was working out really well? Do we really have to disrupt? Can they offer telehealth? Are there other things that you can kind of access? Or can the therapist help do some sessions until you can bridge over to a new therapist and kind of help get the new therapist up to speed, so the child doesn't have to again tell their entire story to a person that's a stranger? This one is super important, history of fire setting. A couple have made it through, even though I've asked it. We've had a couple that have had some fire setting situations. So one that I always like to ask. And then again, history of harming animals. Is there any trauma history? And then I usually like to find out if there's family mental health history available. So that will tell me parents' mental health needs. Are there any documented significant incidents with the family due to mental health needs or struggles, things like that? Just kind of gives me an idea of what I'm working with. As far as supports and services, so a CCBHC is a Center for Community Mental Behavioral Health. And so what that is case managers, therapy, medication management, all located in one agency that's all through in your community. That's the whole goal. And so all of these below, I know they may be small, but all of these will service the state or the color that it's based on. And so when you think about being able to access care quickly or needing like behavioral supports in place quickly, usually the mental health centers can get you in relatively quickly. And then they also work with the MCOs, or the managed care organizations that the insurance is through. And so they help access, if you need a acute stay, or if you need a long-term PRTF, you're requesting for the child to go into a psychiatric residential treatment facility for, 60 days to 6 months, they're the ones that help or kind of navigate those services. And so it's super helpful to kind of get those established. I always recommend getting them established ahead of time, or like as soon as your child comes into your care, getting those supports in place, because then you're not kind of already in a crisis and already too late trying to access these. This way they have time to kind of build a relationship and all those things. And then other behavioral and mental health resources. This is on Children's Mercy website. And so we do offer therapy through Children's Mercy. All of these are also offered through telehealth options. And so CPP is for kids under the age of, I think it's 7, no, 2 to 5, that have experienced traumatic events. And so this is therapeutic work to then work on trauma that those kids have experienced. And then TFCBT is for those 5 and older, up to 17 years old, and usually 12 to 20 sessions, working on traumatic events. It can be anything from car accidents to, I think being changed placements a multitude of times can also involve trauma. And so getting that worked on is super helpful. PCIT therapy. So if you have a child under the age of 7 who has pretty significant behavioral concerns, this helps with aggression, noncompliance, super effective. This is one that I actually do at Mercy. And so highly recommend it if you have any of those kiddos 7 or under. This is even good for your biological children, just to help with behavior intervention strategies. You're coached on how to deal with and manage tantrums and behaviors and different things like that. And then, of course, general family therapy, just to work through some of those family structural issues, communication, all those things. And then we also have a care workshop, which is essentially a 2-day class over a weekend. It's free, super fantastic. It's essentially a crash course in PCIT therapy, super helpful. This one doesn't have an age restriction. Well, I guess it does, ages 2 to 12, but if you have like a younger kiddo, you can always take it too. And then we do have our depression and anxiety clinic. This one would probably be more specific. They do not offer telehealth right now currently, but if you live in the Kansas City metro, this is for youth 12 to 17 who either have a diagnosis or are suspected of having depression or anxiety. We also have our Ruby Autism Parent Coaching Program. This is for youth or caregivers, or this is for caregivers who have youth who either have autism or a developmental disability. And so this is offered over telehealth with caregivers, and then is done either in an individual or a group format. And it's offered in English and Spanish, and then for ages 2 to 10. And so you do not have to have a diagnosis of autism. It's just suspected, or also if you have a developmental disability, suspected, not necessarily diagnosed, you can access that program. And then we do have our acute mental health screening team, also known as our AIMS team. And then they are staffed 24/7, 365. They work in our emergency departments. And then they determine if a kid needs an acute stay or not for usually suicidal, homicidal ideations or behavioral concerns. And then for autism, developmental disabilities, we always refer out to the CDDOs, which are the Community Developmental Disability Organizations. These are the ones that also have a really long wait list. I think right now it's like 12 years. So the earlier that you get the diagnosis, and then the earlier that you get the kiddo on the waiver wait list, the better. They do have crisis funding available, but it is very, very, very limited, and they are very specific. If a kid is going to be disrupted on due to behaviors or things like that, sometimes they will help step in and get services in place quicker. So just knowing that that's available is super helpful. And then crisis support. So you have a kiddo or a teenager who is in crisis. All these are super helpful. So we have our 988 crisis text or call line. In most, I would say, populated areas, in some rural areas, I know that they're starting to roll out CIT officers, which are they're trained in de-escalation techniques. And so if you live in Kansas City, I know that you can usually call and ask for a sit officer to respond. And so usually it's either an officer that has been trained, or sometimes they have co-responders, which are usually social workers who respond to help in mental health crises. Emergency departments, so even your local emergency department can also do mental health screenings, or typically what happens if they're in Western Kansas, they then ship them to Children's Mercy or somewhere in Wichita, and then we'll do those evaluations there. In-home, they do offer a behavior intervention support team, but are also known as BIST. And so that's a behavioral intervention team that can help support kiddos in the home. It also works with the parents for behavioral crises. And then local community mental health centers. There is also a program called Prepped and Ready. This will cover topics for means restriction. And if you complete it, it is free to do. If you complete it, they will send you a medication lockbox and then a gun lock. And I think there's one other thing that they include in there. But it's a free program put on through Children's Mercy, and it was developed by one of our psychiatrists who this is her kind of passion. And so highly recommend it, checking it out. Even if you don't have kiddos who are teenagers yet, super helpful to think about because the kiddos that come in through the ER typically have ingested over-the-counter medications, such as like ibuprofen, Tylenol, those types of medications. Those are usually what they get their hands on. And so thinking about locking those up before you guys get to that point is always super helpful. And then we have the severely emotionally disturbed waiver through the state of Kansas, or the MCOs who manage that. And so what that is that's a yearly waiver that you can qualify for through the community mental health centers that will help give additional support. So you usually get a wraparound facilitator, as well as a case manager, parent support worker, different people involved to help kind of make sure. It's essentially, the thought is to kind of wrap around the child to make sure that they have all of the services and supports that they need. And so again, your child will just have to qualify or do a evaluation every year to see if they continue to qualify for those services. And then respite is also one that is paid for through that waiver also. And so you can also call the number on the back of your insurance card for behavioral health supports, or ask for a list of providers in your area that take your insurance. Most people don't know that. And so free service, free to access. You can call it as many times as you need to. Sometimes they do have behavioral health specialists within the insurance companies to help you navigate that system also. And then the intellectual disability and developmental disability waiver, and that is the one that's put on through the CDDO. And so accessing those waivers can help get different things paid for, such as like ABA and different therapies that the kiddo may need. And then, so things to think about before preparing for your first placement. So are you taking boys or girls? Toiletries on hand. Are you going to need different toiletries that females may need versus males? What does that look like? If you take a trans kiddo, again, are you going to need different toiletries based on the kiddo? I typically, when we have taken teens, I usually put like a little basket together. I usually put snacks in there. I usually put toiletries, a new toothbrush, toothpaste. I usually buy like the smaller ones just to start off with, but like, hey, kind of welcome to our home. I always offer to wash their clothes right when they get here, making sure that you have age-appropriate toys as options. When we first got our 6-year-old, he was the youngest that we'd ever taken, and so I had no 6-year-old toys. I was able to reach out on Facebook, and a lot of people were able to give me a lot of toys within 24 hours. And so by the time he came to us, I had all kinds of options for him to play with, thankfully, and then was able to kind of pick some up along the way. And then having quick, easy meal options. And so if you know that your placement's going to be coming at 8 o'clock at night, having something easy that you can just pop in, frozen meal, not ideal, but again, something quick, you can give them a meal. Warm food is better than nothing. And then again, what would a boy versus a girl need? I usually like to have multiple bedding options. So I usually, in our room that we use for foster kiddos, I will keep a couple spare sheets and then do a couple of different colors along with blankets and things like that. And then I don't ever ask them to talk about their history or where they've been or why they're in placement or anything like that. I usually just let them start talking when they're ready. And then I always like to usually start off with like movies and snacks. Right when they get here, just kind of hang out, not making things super stressful, showing them around the house, asking for some of their preferences. So that way, over the next couple days, I can make meals that they like, try and stick away from some things that they may dislike. And then, are you going to need diapers, other baby products, having those on hand and readily accessible if you need. And then something that's super important is understanding the child's history. So knowing your parenting style and determining what your child was used to is super important. If you're coming in super heavy with a bunch of rules and expectations and they've never had rules or expectations, probably not going to end well. How are you going to set up consequences? What does that look like for you and your family? Is that timeout? Is that chores? Is that taking technology away? And then how will you give positive attention? I always like to try and focus on positive things that they're doing rather than pointing out the not so good or negative things that they're doing. And so praising them, giving them lots of praise and attention for all the positive things, because oftentimes they have been reinforced with negative behaviors. And so taking some of those things into consideration. And so understanding functions of behavior or why it's occurring. When a child has a behavior, usually that's always some form of communication. So what is the child trying to communicate? And so are you having big feelings? Are you super angry? Are you mad about something? Talk through it when you can. Usually not when they're upset, because that's not super helpful. And then keep in mind that the child is losing all the connections with every move. So every time the child moves, they're losing connections to their foster family, their friends, family, teachers, all their support people. Every single time that they move, they're losing every single one of those connections and having to restart over. So it would be super hard to build super strong friendships or trust people when you're in that environment constantly. And so having empathy while also teaching boundaries is super important. Kids need boundaries, they need rules, expectations, but also being understanding of them not having them before, just super helpful. And then something else that's super important is understanding trauma, how it impacts the brain, behavior, and development. I would say probably 90% of the kiddos in foster care have experienced some form of trauma. And just because you may not think it's trauma doesn't mean that they don't see it that way or didn't interpret it that way. So important to keep in mind. But also, it doesn't give them a right to act or behave a certain way. And so setting those rules and expectations is super important. And then determine if the child is acting developmental age versus biological age. So are they where they're supposed to be developmentally as well as biologically? So we've had some 14, 15-year-olds that function more at like an 8-year-old level. And so understanding their needs and meeting them where they are is super important. So that way I can tailor their chores and expectations to an 8-year-old rather than 15, 16-year-old. And then tie rules and expectations back to safety. So anytime I am trying to talk with kiddos about why we have certain rules, why we have certain expectations, I'm always tying that back to safety. So don't get in a car with strangers. Make sure you look before you cross the street. All these things, right? Like don't answer the door if you don't know who's there. Always tying it back to those safety aspects. And so I have found that when you tie it back to safety, they're usually a little bit more less likely to be so resistant to those rules when you explain it in kind of that safety aspect. And then obviously don't try and tackle every single problem at once. You're not going to be able to solve everything overnight. And so it is a process. It does take time. And so focus on one task, get that mastered, and then move on to the next skill or task that you're trying to teach or learn, and then so on and so forth. And then ways to get support. Facebook groups are super helpful. Building a support network through church, community, or friends. The church that we attend, Church of the Resurrection, they have a really robust program that they do all kinds of work with the foster care agencies, trainings, super supportive of the LGBT community. And so building those connections up, asking for help when you need it, taking breaks, asking for respite, asking for family to come in and watch the kiddos for a weekend if you need a break. All those things, super important. My husband and I have built up over the years a pretty robust team of support to help because you're going to need it. And then ask for what you need. So if you need something from the case manager, ask them. If you need help with transporting the kiddo to appointments, ask them. If you need help getting medication, if you need help managing all these appointments, you can ask for that support and help. It's not all on you to take on and manage this entire child's life, just you solely. And then have case manager and others support with appointments and travel. You don't have to take everything on alone. Family workers are there to support you and help problem solve. So utilize your family workers and case managers. That's what they're there for. So super important knowing rules and regulations. So some things that we've had to learn over the years is no trampolines, need someone to be CPR certified to swim, need a letter of travel if traveling outside of the state for more than 24 hours. You have to complete monthly fire drills, tornado drills, having emergency kits in the home and in the cars, locking up medications, locking up liquor, background checks for anyone who's going to be in or out of the home, as well as who's going to be supervising or watching the children. And then individuals background check who are going to provide daily care for the child. And then does the child have any time built in where they can be left alone? That's usually called independent care time. Is that built in? If so, how many hours? What does that look like? What are the rules and regulations around that? Yearly forms that need to be completed are the Can Be Healthy forms, dentist appointments, and then vision checks usually are the three main things that you have to do yearly at minimum. And then knowing when appointments are and then and who they're with is super important. And so if you're able to get any of that background information or from the Red Book, access any of the appointment providers or things like that, it's always super helpful. And then ways to create a supportive environment. So build empathy, just understand where they're coming from, understand all the connections that they've lost, how emotionally taxing that is. Communicate inclusively, so maintain or enhance self-esteem, and then listen and respond with empathy, but also having boundaries and all those things, super important. Ask for help and involvement when you're needing help. Share thoughts and feelings to build trust. Include important people or stakeholders that are involved in the child's care. So teachers, faculty, mentors, anybody that's involved with that child, having them at the table to help support that child is super important. Or if there's anybody from the child's past that's willing to kind of talk to them and help, super helpful. So self-reflect, being able to self-reflect myself and why am I making assumptions? It's not always all or nothing. Allowing for honest feedback. So get comfortable with conflict, trying to understand somebody else's point of view, create opportunities for growth, listening for content, intent, emotions, all those things, understanding perspectives, resolving conflict. Conflict's natural, it's going to happen. But being able to have better decision-making is always super important. And then I hear what you're saying, but that's not how it's going to roll, or that's not how it's going to happen. Those things are super important. And then so questions. So true or false, can you travel outside of the state without permission?
False. Oh, I guess it didn't say how much time though, too.
Yes, absolutely. So if you are just popping over to Missouri for the day, you don't need permission, but if you're outside for more than 24 hours, absolutely. I also did not know that CPR certification is now required whether you have a pool or not. I do know that if you even went to like a public pool, you still had to have it. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that was part of the new regulations. I attended a training on that a couple of weeks ago.
Interesting. Always changing.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I think I went too far. Wait, I already gave it. Okay, so you can have anyone provide childcare. So the answer is false. So you have to have somebody background checked. If it's like Y Care or something through the school, you typically don't have to have those individuals like background checked or anything like that. But if it's anybody in your home, such as a nanny or anything like that, you're going to have them background checked and approved prior to them being able to watch the child. And then question 3, you can let your teen stay home for a few hours when it or with it in their self-care plan. Cannot read today.
True.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, so if they have self-care hour, self-care plan, it usually is very specific. So it'll lay out like child can stay at home for 2 hours daily to do ADLs or chores independently, or they're able to cook certain things independently. All those things are going to be laid out. If there's things that you're uncomfortable with, you can ask for that to be changed also. And then the child in your home can change levels of care. It already gave the answer to, so yes, they can. So if you get a kiddo who comes in as a basic 1, doesn't think that you have, or they don't think that the child's going to have very many needs, and then you come to find out like the child has all kinds of needs and all kinds of mental health struggles and things like that, you can ask for them to reassess and then advocate for an increase of daily rate. Again, if you're putting in the work and the time and the energy and effort, you should also be reimbursed for some of that. And so we have advocated several times for changes in care. If we get a kiddo a diagnosis of something, anything like that, we usually advocate for a change of level, especially if it's like autism or something like that. Then we're always going to advocate for an increase. And then you are solely responsible for managing all the child's appointments.
False.
No, you're definitely not. So it's not up to you, solely responsible for you to manage all those appointments. That's why you have a care team. Case manager helps with transportation. If you can't make certain appointments, they can help transport all those things. You just have to let them know ahead of time. I'm not able to transport to these appointments due to these reasons, and then they'll help